choice of topic.
Well, I was told to do the joy of being Catholic. No, I was also told to look over Father Mike Schmitz's thing about why be Catholic, and he talks a lot about that same thing of like, how do you know, right? How do you know whether your talk is there? But then I thought about it and I was like, well, I don't want to go to these big books and say, this book says this interpret it. I was like, I want to tell about stories of people I've met, right? I thought that would probably help more. I hope it did. Did it?
It did.
Okay. Thanks. And lots of prayer, by the way. That's also where these ideas get formulated.
Any other questions? Yeah.
What if you have said if you've lost in joy, then that's from God. What if you had lost in joy, but it wasn't actually like a good thing, but like you didn't actually regret anything? Like you didn't know, let's say?
I think there can be lasting satisfaction. Like, if you were to get revenge on a bully, right? That would sort of be lasting satisfaction, right? I put him down. I said that thing, right? But you know, as I'm describing that sensation of revenge on a bully, right? That it's not quite joy. It's satisfaction, right? It doesn't quite bring a peace with it as well, right? Does that? Yeah. Now there can be like, I'm afraid of heights, so I went bungee jumping, right? I'm proud that I did it. Still makes me kind of happy, but it's not joy, right? You know, there's also definitely not a sin, right? I mean, I don't know, see mum covering her face in case I just gave bad ideas, but anyway, it's not a sin, as long as the cords are done and security, all that sort of thing, but it's not, if you ever felt joy, you know the difference. Think of, could it be your first communion? It could be if you came out of a confession, especially blessed confession. Could be a moment of prayer. Could also be that you're with your family and know you're loved. Could be a moment where a teacher through whom God's grace was working praised you and appreciated you, made you feel worthwhile, right? Those are joys. There's other things that can be like, oh yeah, the time we had a eating competition and I won, right? I ate the most hamburgers and I was sick afterwards, but I beat the other guys. I mean, sure, lasting recognition and satisfaction, but not quite joy. Does that help? You might need to describe the situation.
Basing off the last question, what if you do something good, like you know it's good, it's a good thing to do, but like you don't actually get lost in joy from it?
That can happen. I mean, there could be, if you forgave your bully, I doubt you would have lasting joy from that, because you'd still have a lot of overlapping emotions. We are not mercenaries with God, or we often want to be, but myself included, but not every good deed comes with a corresponding payback of good feeling, right? If we were doing that, we would not be good for goodness' sake, we'd be good for pleasure's sake, right? So God has wired the human psyche in such a way that sometimes we get a gift of joy, but it's not always. Very often, doing the right thing, and go read the Psalms, does not lead to even reward or satisfaction, but that's where faith kicks in that it will happen. I counsel some very difficult cases in the Philippines, and what brings me peace is I know there will be justice, not in this life, but in life 2.0, right? And that does bring me peace, because in some of those situations there is no peace at all, and there's no hope that things are going to get better, right? There's certain fundamental unfairnesses that aren't overcome and can't be undone, right? But in life 2.0 they will be undone, right? But it doesn't mean that when I'm talking to this person or that person, I'm happy about what they're going through, right? Does that help?
Any other one?
Which books of the Bible do you recommend to read on a daily or at least glance Don't help in the faith.
Well, first of all, I'd say you're going to find your own, right? Go through and find your own, find the ones that speak to you the most. I love to find patterns and things. So Gospel of St. John is almost like addictive in that sense, because he has these, technically it's called chiastic, but basically it's the sign of an X. So let's take John chapter 20, okay? Start off with his finger on purpose. He starts off with Peter and John who run to the tomb, and they see, or John sees the signs and believes, right? Then second appearance is Jesus with Mary Magdalene. He calls her name and she answers and touches his feet, and that's how she comes to believe. Third, Jesus appears to the disciples, breathes on them, and says, "Peace be with you." So that's a deeper level of contact. He's impacting them, right? Fourth is St. Thomas. He calls Thomas by name and Thomas touches the wounds. So it's similar to Mary Magdalene, right? And then it says, I couldn't write everything that Jesus did in the Bible. These signs are written so that you believe. So all of a sudden, we are included in that fifth segment of the Gospel of John in that chapter. So I find those, just looking at those patterns makes me, I love to find patterns, and I don't know, it's sort of, nowadays we have Easter eggs in movies. So St. John is full of Easter eggs, so I love St. John, but there's other things there that are also like, I also love the letters of St. John, but it really will depend on the day. I will happily confess to word searching. I have, there's little apps that have the Bible on it. You can search, you can look for a word and say, where is that word showing up in the New Testament, for example? Or in St. Paul, what did St. Paul mean by the word worthy or good enough, right? And then I'd search and read those passages, read more than a verse. That's the one thing that as Catholics we do is we read sections, we don't read just a verse. Very often one verse will be the main quote that sticks with us, but the context is actually really important. But if you, at St. Anthony's and probably here, there's a big thing of St. Luke's. Why? Because on every third year, so year A, the Sunday Gospels are St. Matthew. Year B, they're St. Mark. That's why year B readings on Sundays or Sunday Masses are shorter, because it's a shorter Gospel. Year C is St. Luke, and then Christmas time, Lent and Easter tend to be around using this Gospel of St. John. So if you go to Sunday Mass, you do hear pretty much all of the Gospels anyway. And that often heads you towards, okay, there's this. And if you go to daily Mass, they go through also all of the Gospels. I think starting with Matthew, kind of in the same way as well, to get you really acclimatized. So you already, if you go to Mass on Sunday, you already hear a lot. And when you start finding, I like this, you can start heading in that direction. So, but what you're going to like and what I like do not have to be the same thing. That's where we're both loosed. And God has His way for you and for each of you. And that's the adventure, right?
Thanks for that.
Welcome.
Does anyone have anything? Well, I've got a question. I've really talked about it with just a couple of friends and already just about that truth, because today there's my truth and your truth and all that. How can you explain to someone, especially who's not Catholic, who hasn't known God and all that? How can you explain what the real truth, what is truth? Because I know it's a bit of a deeper question, but rather than just kind of talking about subjective and objective truth, is there something other than that I could talk about and maybe say to help them understand what truth is?
That's where I go to my philosophy degree. No, which is fair.
Curious,
For that, there's one starting point, but it's a very annoying starting point for them, not for us, is in a cartoon skit, which is an easier way to explain this than in a philosophy manner. In a cartoon skit, there's this guy holding a sign which says, all truths are relative, right? And in that cartoon, which is it's not a Catholic or a Christian cartoon even, the superhero, this is a moment for obvious man who tears off his suit and appears in a yellow costume and says, if all truths are relative, then your truth is relative, and therefore, but what you're saying is an absolute statement, so it can't be relative. And then the guy holding the sign does this poof and implodes, right? So that's a non-philosophical way of saying that if every truth is relative, then that statement is also therefore relative. Or if nothing is absolute, the word nothing is an absolute word. So you're therefore saying some things are absolute and some things are not. And that's some way you can start them walking on that path. But at your age, I was very passionate about truth and ideals. I still am, otherwise I wouldn't be doing this, right? But what I've been discovering is intellectual conversions are really small in number, right? Most of the time there's going to be a reason in that person's heart as to why they believe that. Nowadays, very often the reason is they're afraid of people who have absolute certainties. Why? Because they meet people who read the Bible a certain way and then go down this track at, kind of like traveling down a 30-kilometer road at 90 kilometers and smash into things with their certainties and knock people over and hurt people. Or maybe that's just what they saw on TV, right, about believers. Usually believers are not very well represented on TV, right? So maybe that's what's instilled a fear in them of absolute certainties, right? And usually you could do the obvious man joke with them, but it won't tackle the fear. So the question is, why do they have that fear? Or if we can't know anything, what's the purpose of life? Or everyone just has their own purpose, in which case, how do you fight? I was fascinated by John Malkovich's character. Yeah, it's a really older movie. But it's an older movie out where Clinton Eastwood was old, and that was already 20 years ago, called In the Line of Fire. And he's a very Nietzschean villain in the sense that John Malkovich's character, he's really good at playing a bad guy, by the way. Life has no meaning, so I'm going to have fun, and the most challenging option is to kill the US president, right? And during the whole movie, there's nothing Clint Eastwood can convince him that, no, this is a bad idea, because the reference point of John Malkovich is life is worthless, have fun, do something challenging. This is really challenging, I'm doing it, I'm having fun, right? That's it. And so if everything is relative, then you can get some terrible terrorists. Or you might say, okay, if everything is relative, what's wrong with Jeff Bezos, killing small companies, then using a rocket to go to the moon in the middle of a pandemic instead of distributing vaccines to poor nations, right? And they'll probably be like, oh yeah, that probably was a bad idea. But if it was a bad idea, you're telling Jeff Bezos what to do, right? And therefore you do believe that some things are, So I think by now people are beginning to say, yeah, maybe everything is relative, but I hate what that businessman is doing, right? Or political season is a great time to realize that people who say everything is relative have very definite opinions about how votes should be cast, right? So start digging and you'll start realizing, they'll start saying, no, but this is an absolute thing for me. Like, usually someone who says everything is relative will have very definite ideas on climate change and on throwing away rubbish, right? And that's a door. But don't challenge them. Work with them on what they're passionate about. There's a small book, it's a really small book, called How to Defend the Faith Without Losing Your Temper, or something like that. That's basically the argument. And it followed what this one guy did he was known as sound blurb guy when he was in World Youth Convention in Cologne, because he had sound bites which could be said into a TV camera. He'd obviously practiced them and he knew what to say, but he could put it into a small caption that could be played on TV. But his main trick was when someone says, I don't know, let's say abortion, right? His main trick was not to contradict. You say abortion is wrong. Well, the reporter would say, you say abortion is wrong. Why, right? And he wouldn't start saying we believe in the value of every life. Of course he does, right? Because that's impact. That's their value versus his value. But he would start off with their values, all obviously, for example, the support of women. And so he would say, we love all women, we defend all women, we want women to succeed. That's why we've, from the Middle Ages we were doing, I mean, of course, I'm heading outside of the sound blurb territory with that, but he would head with how we are supporting women, right? And then go from there towards, and we support all women, perhaps even in the womb, or head in that direction. So find what they already want, and then just steer that. It's sort of like mental jujitsu, right? Karate, you block them, right? But in jiu-jitsu, you take the impalm and punch and just keep on pulling on the same direction. And that's the beauty of our faith, is that all great desires lead to God. So never be afraid of someone who's passionate about anything. Find what they're passionate about, and then find the way that leads to God. They probably know their way, their passions, if misguided, would destroy other people. So they're already aware, and you just keep on guiding that to make sure, and they'll be like, oh yeah, well, I wouldn't do that, I wouldn't do that. And maybe things are more free than they should be, and maybe we shouldn't use the Bible to mandate economic policy. I think that's fair, right? I mean, certain things, of course, helping the poor is a great idea. But at the same time, they'd be saying, you can't do the Jeff Bezos thing, right? And you say, okay, well, how would you guide a Jeff Bezos, right? And then now you're working with them on something they believe, and suddenly they're discovering things are, there are morals, and we need them. Oh, and what am I going to say to Jeff Bezos? And he would say that. Well, I'm going to have to contradict that, so I have to find some absolute values. And wait, and all of a sudden, you're on the same page, and you didn't fight, right? That'd be my, but it's individual.
Yeah. Thank you for that. Yeah, hopefully you guys got something too. It's like, I feel like that's so common though, Father, because especially people were saying the free country, right? Yeah. How it's funny how sometimes we can be like, hey, it's free country, people can do whatever they want. But at the same time, when someone does something wrong, it's we're quick to judge.
Yeah.
And so it's it's just a thing. So I guess people still are struggling to understand.
Right.
There are morals and there are right and wrong.
Mm-hmm.
It's it's not just this free country.
Right.
Or that Statue of Liberty in America. Right. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you for that.
Thank you.
Does anyone else have questions? Does anyone ask? Oh, he's still here. Do you have a question or?
Because you were saying about how prayer is very powerful, but I was also thinking what's another practical way that we can live out the faith, especially nowadays when it's a bit difficult to, because of social media and all that stuff. But what's one way, or any possible way, that we can live out the faith and become a true youth Catholic?
I've been reading about St. Paul. I was trying to figure out what his life would be like. This is a theory, but he was a tent maker, right? And in some of his writings, he says he was not good at speaking, right? Especially in the letter to the Corinthians. He apologizes for not being impressive as a speaker. I might need to make the same apology here, I don't know. But in which case, sorry. And so people are saying, well, there's one interpretation is, well, if he wasn't good at speaking, how did he convert people, right? And it definitely failed when he went to the Areopagus, right? And another part where he's preaching and someone falls asleep, right? And even falls out the fourth-story window, that's how sleepy he got, and dies and has to be resurrected. But anyway, so what did he do, right? Apart from being holy in prayer, they said, well, maybe, tent making is a laborious thing. And he always worked to provide for himself, right? So he had a job. But perhaps he would come in and sit down and he would start sharing slowly, one-on-one, while he made his tent, right? I think that's at least a starting way. Maybe one of you or you will have a gift, and this is already a sharing of the faith, by the way, but maybe one of you would have a gift that leads you into a YouTube or a Facebook or a blog or whatever, or something more impacting, or a speaking role. Great, but that's probably the few. Most of you might be more drawn to the St. Paul tent maker style, where someone who works alongside you, kind of like that jiu-jitsu example, they already like what you like. And if you're full of confidence and peace, that's already a start. But you do have to take it into more than just, a pleasant conversation together about footy or politics or the weather. It has to head towards, they notice you praying, right? My dad, who was a very quiet person, he said that everyone knew that he and this other guy were the two who were Christians. He was Catholic, of course, and the other guy was Christian in the workplace of Porto Targo. And whenever a temptation came through, I don't know what that was, my dad didn't describe it to me, it might have been cheating on taxes, or it might have been a lewd email or picture or whatever, everyone would look at them to see how they reacted, to see if they would live the morals that they preached. They already knew he was Catholic. He was the Catholic guy, right? And he was the standard. And that's already a form of preaching, right? So when you get a job, work hard, work well, have a picture of God or a picture of Christ, Mary, be willing to speak about. And I would also say, let's take it a step higher. Be willing to invite someone too, right? There are, 1/6 of the world is Catholic. If every Catholic decided to invite one other person to be Catholic, and if each of you managed to bring one other person to be Catholic in 20 years, if everyone did that, in 20 years, 1/3 of the world will be Catholic. And then 20 years later, 2/3. So how about you start with one person? Who is that one person that it would be for you? And do you know your own faith? There's a famous Australian in the States whose name is Matthew Kelly, who's written a number of very short books that are very good. But he talks about the 4 secrets of dynamic Catholics. And he said prayer is one of them. He says, every single Catholic who's running some sort of parish organization, which is usually a 6% of every parish, they all pray something. Apart from Mass, they all say some type of prayer, pray in some way. They all study. They all keep learning about the faith or reading the Bible or something, catechism, fathers of the church, lives of saints, but they're reading. They're not static or stuck. They all are generous with time or at least with money. And then there's a 4th one, which is they've all found a way to share in some way. They're sharing a faith in some way. So prayer and study is definitely the starting point. And again, it doesn't have to be like go take a theology course, but it would be something. It would be at least starting to read a book. Imagine you grab a book, a spiritual book, a book about faith, you put a post-it in it, and every day that post-it has to advance at least 1 page. That's really not too much. Maybe make it 5. Or maybe you read 5 minutes or 15 minutes every day, right? And you just do that every day. That could be the advance. And then you have something to share with one person. And again, if God calls you to a more active form of service, He'll let you know if you're praying. So, or if you come and talk to a priest, a spiritual guide, and you say, Father, I have these gifts, we'll find a way. But I'm very hesitant to give a blanket response because I don't know you and I want you to be free. I don't want to say that, but yeah.
Thank you, Robert.
You're welcome.
Really insightful. Does anyone else have anything before we...
They can smell the pizzas.
Yeah.
Right, the titos, older couples. No. John.
Just a quick one.
Yeah.
Here we go.
All right. What is your favorite prayer?
My favorite prayer is definitely what's called mental prayer. So it's inside of I will very often imagine myself talking with Christ or in a scene of the gospel or with Mary or with Saint Joseph. Best way is when I'm walking outside in nature. That's my preferred. Now there is a second, it does depend on the day or the mood, but there will be times when that best prayer is in the chapel on my knees in silence. So it sort of depends. God is real, the Holy Spirit is real. He'll also let you know when one type or the other is the better. If you've experienced enough in prayer, it kind of gets like, what restaurant are you going to go to? there comes a moment where you're like, oh, well, but I have hankering for Hungry Jack's, right? Or for Domino's or whatever, right? And then you know what's going to bring you joy and God joy as well. So, I mean, experience around, find the different types, but then you'll also find the one you like the most. But my favorite is mental prayer. Usually, most people who are advanced, who go beyond just like praying prayers by rote, will get into mental prayer, but it does take a bit longer to get there. It takes more practice, but it's definitely worthwhile. Real prayer is union with God. Whatever gets you to that is already prayer. So it's not too complicated, but usually when you go to the dinner table, you have to leave your room. You better put your phone in your pocket and it better not ring or else you'll get busted, right? And you have to be willing to listen, right? In the same way for prayer, we have to leave our ordinary life, which is sometimes hard. So often your mum might say, come down now, right? Sometimes, but God's not going to yell, so sometimes it's hard for us to leave our stuff to do, right? We have to put our phone away, it has to be on silent mode, or else it distracts us in prayer. Our things to do have to be there, and we've got to really put ourselves present. So prayer is not as easy as it sounds until you get used to it, or it just takes a type of a discipline that that is not so easy nowadays, especially with phones that we carry walking distractions with us at all moments. So, yeah.
That's it? I mean, if you're wanting to ask questions, you can ask them after. Why do you eat donuts? So we're going to move on to the next part, but again, let's give another round of applause.
Thank you.